All right, 3-3, congruent triangles. So if we have congruent triangles, they are congruent in which they're triangles in which corresponding sides and angles, so their corresponding sides and angles are congruent. We're going to talk about the corresponding part. We know from parallel lines and transversals that corresponding meant kind of the same spot. And so that's what we're looking at. Corresponding sides and angles are congruent. So let's look at this picture here below. We were given here that triangle EHG is congruent to triangle KFG. So if we break this down, the first letter here is going to be corresponding to this letter here. So E and K are corresponding. Then H and F are corresponding. And then the two G's are corresponding. So when you go to look at your picture, we know that E and K are corresponding, which means that the triangles have been flipped, okay? Then we know that H and F, and so I'm going to mark those with a double arc to show that they're different, but they do correspond, so the twos correspond, and then our G's are corresponding on either side. And that's where I got the 1, 2, and 3 from. And so now we're going to write those statements out. We said first here that E and K were congruent, so angles E and angle K. We knew that H and angle F are congruent. But now let's talk about G. We can't just say G is congruent to G because you wouldn't know exactly which triangle you're talking about. So if there are multiple angles at one letter, you have to name them with their 3 letters. So I could say something like EGH is congruent to KGF. If you start with E, you would have to start with K because they correspond. So we could say, let's zoom out again, EGH. And we have to do corresponding. Again, we start with E, we have to start with K, KGF. Again, the reason we use 3 letters is because there were multiple angles at one letter. So now let's talk about corresponding sides for a minute. And you can use your angle markings to your advantage here. So let's start with EH. E to H. So we can start here with E to H, and that's a side, so put your line over it. If we start with E, then we have to start with K, so EH is congruent to KF. Okay, and then I'm going to go to E to G. So E to G corresponds to K to G because the E and the K are corresponding. And then the third side, H to G, if we start with H, then we need to start with F on the other, so HG and FG. We're just listing out all the different side combinations and who they correspond to show that they're congruent on either side of those triangles there. Okay, to show that triangles are congruent, we have to use one of the following 5 criteria in different theorems here. So your S's are going to stand for sides, A stand for angle. So looking at the first one here, SSS stands for side, 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 meaning that we know something about all 3 sides to show that they're congruent. So notice the markings here. This side, and this side are all marked, and the same thing on the other triangle. So side, side, side. Anytime you see a tick mark, that represents a side being congruent. We look at the next one here, and if I look at my picture to start with, I see a marking here, so that represents a side. This little arc mark right here represents an angle, and then a double tick is also a side, just showing that it's a different length than the previous side. So this is SAS, which stands for side, angle, side, congruency. Okay, the next one here, let's go zoom into our picture for a minute. We have an arc mark here, so we can say that those angles are congruent. Notice I'm only marking one picture, I'm not marking both. Otherwise it gets to be too many A's and S's and all kinds of things. Then we have a tick mark, so that's S for side. And then we have another double arc, and so that's another angle, but it's showing that it's different from the previous angle. So we have angle, side, angle. next one here. Zoom in again. We have an angle marking here. We have another angle marking here. And we have a tick mark for an S for side. So this one is angle, angle, side. Now, you may be thinking, well, what's the difference between the two? Angle, side, angle, and angle, angle, side. What matters is where the side is. So if you look here in green, do you see how the side with the tick mark is between the two angles? And if we look at the next one, it's not between the two angles. So when it's connecting the two angles together with the tick mark, it's angle, side, angle. If it's away from the two angles, not between, then it is angle, angle, side. Our last one here to talk about is HL. HL deals with right triangles only. And so if we have a right triangle, we know that the side across from the right angle is called the hypotenuse, and the sides that make the right angles are called your legs. So HL stands for hypotenuse leg. And if we look here, we only need to mark one leg. We do need to know first off if it's a right triangle. So if it's a right triangle, your first thought should be, is this hypotenuse leg? If it's not, then you can go to one of the other types of congruency statements. So if we look here, we can see that our hypotenuse is marked, so we can say H, and we have another side being marked here, that is an L, so we know that it is hypotenuse leg. So let's practice these. Remember, label your pictures first. It'll make this so much easier to identify which one of the 5 it is. So we've got to do a couple of things on the next few problems. One, we have to state our congruent parts, how they're congruent, meaning one of these 5, and then writing our congruency statement to say that our triangles are congruent. So let's look at our pictures first. I see here one tick here and one tick here, so that's side. Then I see an angle marking here at B and E, so that would be angle. And then I see another set of tick marks here, and so that would be a side. So we can see this is side, angle, side, SAS. So we need to represent all those parts. The first side that we marked congruent was AB, and it corresponded to who on the other side? We can see the other triangle here has one tick here, and so it corresponds to DE. Then we marked an angle, and so we marked angle B, and angle E was also marked the same, so they are congruent. Notice I am putting the angle markings in there. And then the third piece is another side. So we were given that side and this side being congruent. So BC, and if we start with B, we have to start with E. So BC is congruent to EF. Okay, and those are our parts. And we can see here again that this represents a side, this represents an angle, this represents the second side. And so we can say they are congruent because of side, angle, side congruency. And then we can say that the triangles are congruent. So triangle ABC, doesn't matter what order you start with, but now the order matters. If you start with A, you have to start with the corresponding letter. So that would be D, so triangle DEF. Okay, let's go to the next one here. I see a right angle, so you need to check and see if this is hypotenuse leg first before you go to any of the others. So we can see here that our hypotenuse is marked, but we don't have anything else marked. Well, we know that if two triangles are side by side, then they're sharing that side. That goes back to our proofs when we talked about the reflexive property. Something is congruent to itself. Well, this is another of those cases where PR is the same in both triangle, and so we can say that this is congruent, meaning we do have hypotenuse leg because we have that reflexive side PR. So here we go. We don't have 3 things congruent on this one, we just have H and L. So we can say here that PS, side PS, is congruent to side PQ. We also know that PR is congruent to PR in both triangles. That's your reflexive property. Remember the one that I say duh to. And so that takes care of your two congruencies. We do know that we have a right triangle. So that might be something you want to write down to take note that we used HL because we had the triangle. And so now we can say our two triangles are congruent. You can start with any order here. Let's start with S, P, R. And if we start with S, then we have to start with Q on the other triangle and finish out with PR. Okay, our next one here, again, we want to look at our markings first. I see tick marks, which represent sides. I see another set of tick marks here, which represents another side. But that's only two. We need three things to prove these triangles congruent if it's not HL. And I don't have a right triangle, so it's not going to be HL. Again, we have a shared side here. This is your reflexive property again. They both share side HF. It's in both triangles. So we can go ahead and mark a third set of ticks. And so now we know that this is going to be side, side, side. And you can go ahead and do that once you know what it is. And so let's write our congruency statements. If I start with E and go to F, now let's go EH with the first tick mark. So EH. And if I start with E, then I have to start with G and go G to F. We can see the triangles have been flipped. Our next set of ticks would be E to F. And again, if we start with E, we have to start with G to H. And our last set is our reflexive side, H to F. And because it's been flipped, we would say F to H. And so now we know it's congruent because of side, side, side. All three sides are given as congruent. And so we can say the triangles are congruent. Triangle E, H, F. And again, you can start in any order when you do this. You just have to make sure the second one is matching up. So if I start with E, I have to start with G. Go into H, which means I go to F, and finish out with H. Okay, let's look at this one. So let's look at our markings. I see an arc mark here, which means we have an angle. Then I see a tick mark, which means that's a side, but again, that's only two. We need three things. You don't get to mark sides unless they are reflexive, meaning they're shared. But we can see in our picture here something from the last few units, and we have our vertical angles here, and we know that vertical angles are congruent, and so we can use that as our third statement. And so now we can see that we have angle, side, angle. Our first given was that angle V is congruent to angle Z because they have the same marking. Side VX was congruent to side ZX. And then we can talk about our vertical angles. Well, remember, if there's multiple angles at the same letter, then we have to use three letters to describe it. So if we're going to talk about this one here first on the left side in purple, then we would say angle VXW, our vertex is always in the middle, is congruent to angle, and if we start with V, we have to start with Z, Z, X, Y. Now we have all three parts, angle, side, angle, and we can see that here. We marked angle, and then sides, and then another angle. And so we can say our triangles are congruent, so triangle VXW is congruent to triangle ZXY. Those have to correspond. Again, if you start with V, you have to start with Z on the other side. Just make sure the corresponding parts are matched up correctly. Okay, the symbols are a little different on this one, so let's talk about what those arrows mean. Remember, arrows don't mean congruent, arrows mean parallel. So that's telling me that this line and this line are parallel, meaning here's my transversal, and if I have a transversal, I have here alternate interior angles, and we know alternate interior angles are congruent, so I can use that to my advantage to state that these triangles are congruent. I also have another set of parallel lines here in green, same transversal. Here's a set of alternate angles here again. So you can only use alternate interiors when you have a set of parallel lines, and those will be marked by your arrows. But that's only 2 markings, so I only have angle here and another angle here. Well, what's our third thing that we can mark as congruent? It's that shared side here between the 2 triangles. And so we can see that we have angle, side, angle. So let's mark our congruency statements. So multiple angles at the same letter, so we're going to be using a lot of 3-letter things. So I'm going to start here at J at the top with the 1 arc and say angle KJL is congruent to angle, and if I start with K, then I need to start with MLJ. Then we have, because it's angle, side, angle, I like to keep them in order. Let's talk about our side. We have JL congruent to LJ. We can see that the triangles have been flipped and rotated. And then our last set of alternate interior angles, we have angle KLJ. And angle, if we start with K, we have to start with MJ. So now that we know that our triangles are congruent because of angle, side, angle, we can say that triangle KLJ is congruent to triangle MJL. And I made that easy for myself because I already had my letters set up in order. So I just transferred those down and switched it from an angle symbol to a triangle symbol. And that would be it. So my advice on when you're setting up congruent triangles or determining which one of our 5 theorems to use to prove them congruent, label. Any tick marks, get an S. Arc marks, get an A for angle. And so once you have your 3 parts labeled, and notice I only labeled 1 triangle at a time, I didn't try to do multiple angles, then you can easily see which of the 5 it will be. Remember, if you're going to prove HL down here at the bottom, you have to have a right triangle first. If you don't have